In the long corridors of power, behind velvet curtains and beneath the golden chandeliers that shimmered across polished floors, there lies a truth often brushed away by the myths of royal splendor, a truth that doesn't glisten with jewels or perfume, but instead clings to the shadows, where flesh sweats, hair knots, and human odor lingers in corners no portrait painter ever captured. When we think of royal women, queens adorned with diadems, princesses strolling among rose gardens, duchesses posing in embroidered silks, we imagine perfection sculpted by time. We imagine grace, elegance, refinement. But history, when peeled back slowly like the layers of an old gown, reveals something more human, more fragile, and more pungent than the legends have allowed. Because for all the silks and satins, for all the powdered wigs and pearl-studded bodices, the royal courts of Europe and beyond were not built upon modern understandings of hygiene or health. They were, in many ways, curated illusions of cleanliness, beautiful facades concealing a deeply ingrained aversion to water, to washing, and to the very notion of bodily care as we understand it today. And in this gilded theater of illusion, it was often the women, the very emblems of courtly beauty, who bore the quiet burden of poor hygiene, masked beneath layers of fragrance and ritual, performing cleanliness without ever truly achieving it. What we begin here is not a story of judgment, but one of sleepy observation, a slow descent into the intimate world behind the throne, where elegance and odor walked hand in hand, and where the habits of queens and noblewomen were shaped not by comfort or choice, but by superstition, vanity, and the strange, unwashed customs of the age. This is a story meant not to shock, but to soothe, to gently pull back the veil from centuries past and let the shadows speak in hushed tones. Let us walk now through the perfumed halls and the putrid corridors. Let us listen closely to the whispers beneath the powder and pearls. For in the stillness of midnight, even the most elegant queen may rise from her bed, skin unwashed, mouth dry, garments stiff with wear, and she, too, becomes human at last. And so, we begin, not with a bath, but with the absence of it. In every portrait that survives from the royal courts of the old world, from the candlelit salons of Versailles to the damp stone chambers of Tudor England, one finds a particular gaze, a softness of skin rendered in oil and pigment, a complexion smooth and pale as ivory, eyes calm as if untouched by the dirt of the earth. These were the faces meant to inspire awe, to whisper of divinity, to hold a nation's pride in the curve of a cheek or the stillness of a parted lip. But these painted queens, these serenely postured duchesses, they did not live within the stillness of the canvas. They breathed and aged and itched beneath their brocades. They sweated beneath their corsets. Their underarms, swathed in satin, saw no air for days. Their breath, behind jeweled fans, was sometimes sweet with cloves, and sometimes sharp with rot. And though their lives were steeped in ritual and reverence, the simple act of keeping clean, truly clean, was a ritual the world had not yet learned. The royal courts were places of symbolism, not science. To be royal was to perform an idea, a vision of perfection, unmarred by the earthy needs of the body. And yet the body, despite all gowns and guards, still obeyed nature. It perspired. It decayed. It demanded relief. And for women, whose beauty was often equated with virtue itself, the pressure to appear unblemished meant that their physical functions were not just hidden, they were ignored, denied, sometimes even punished. Bathing, for many centuries, was thought to invite disease. Doctors of the time warned against water opening the pores to unseen miasmas, bad air, they believed, that would seep in and rot the body from within. And so, noblewomen abstained from bathing not out of laziness or neglect, but from a deeply rooted fear, whispered by scholars and reinforced by tradition. Instead of cleansing, they concealed. Scent became their shield, their silent defense against the rising odors of skin confined for too long beneath layers of linen and velvet. Rosewater, musk, civet, exotic oils from distant lands were pressed into handkerchiefs and doused upon sleeves. But beneath the fragrance, the skin remained untouched by water for weeks, sometimes even months. A queen might rise in the morning, her ladies gently dabbing her face with wine-soaked cloths, brushing away the sweat of the night, applying new powder atop yesterday's residue, and tying fresh ribbons over the same yellowing shift. She would be dressed not in comfort, but in spectacle. Her gown might weigh 20 pounds. Her bodice might be laced so tightly she could barely breathe. But to undress entirely, to strip away the layers and stand exposed before water, that was a danger few dared to take. In public, she was grace incarnate. She glided through courtyards with her gloved hand raised just so, her voice lilting like harpsichord music. But in private, behind the thick velvet drapes of her chamber, she might peel away her perfume-soaked wig to reveal a scalp mottled with sores. She might scratch at the reddened skin beneath her stays. Her maid might whisper of lice, of skin that flaked like snow upon the sheets. And still she would not wash. Instead, more powder, more perfume. The illusion must remain. Even in times of celebration, a coronation, a wedding, a state visit, the same rules applied. Royal women were adorned, not bathed. A noblewoman preparing for her marriage might be dressed in pearls and gold lace, her face painted with white lead and rouge, her hair adorned with sprigs of myrtle or jasmine, and beneath it all, her underarms would remain untouched by soap. Her feet, never revealed, might be caked in sweat and dust. Her breath, behind silken lips, might carry the faint rot of unbrushed teeth. But no one would speak of it. Cleanliness, in the royal sense, was not about washing. It was about appearing unsullied. And so, across palaces and courts, across centuries and continents, this dance continued, the illusion of purity atop a foundation of unwashed skin. Servants might notice. Attendants might suffer in silence. But the queens themselves, trained from childhood to sit still, to suppress, to endure, knew no other way. They bore the itch, the stink, the hidden infections, with the same stoicism they used to endure childbirth or the weight of a crown. Their beauty, so admired, so mythologized, came at a quiet cost. And perhaps, in the still of night, when candles burned low and the palace quieted to a hush, one might imagine a royal woman stirring in her sheets, restless in the filth her station demanded she ignore. Perhaps her skin itched with the salt of old sweat. Perhaps her scalp ached beneath her wig. Perhaps she longed, just once, to undress completely and step into warm water, to feel herself washed clean, not in perfume or powder, but in truth. But the truth was feared. And so she rose with the dawn, dressed in fresh scents, and walked again beneath the gaze of a court that never questioned why beauty never smelled like skin. And it was perfume, always perfume, that came next. The morning light crept in through the high windows, filtered by sheer curtains embroidered with golden thread, casting soft beams across the canopied bed where the queen had slept. Or perhaps not quite slept, for rest in those grand chambers was never as peaceful as the poets claimed. Outside the closed windows, Courtiers were already shuffling through the halls, the sounds muffled but constant, the scent of warmed wine and damp rushes creeping under the heavy wooden doors. And within the royal chamber, the rituals of the day were beginning once more. The fire was stirred. The maid entered without speaking, and on a small ivory tray, next to a silver comb and a length of ribbon, she brought what was truly most essential, a cluster of tiny glass vials, each filled with a perfume so strong, so pungent, that it could mask nearly anything. Perfume, for the women of the royal court, was not simply a luxury. It was a necessity, a tool, a defense against the quiet shame of not bathing. In an age when water was feared as much as illness itself, these scented elixirs became substitutes for washing, poured generously on skin that hadn't felt soap in weeks, sometimes months. Where modern cleanliness relies on removal, on scrubbing and rinsing again, the world of queens and duchesses relied on layering. Layer upon layer of scent, cloth, powder, and color, and underneath it all, the human body continued its tireless work, sweating, shedding, aging, aching. The act of applying perfume was ceremonial. It was deliberate. A lady might sit before a carved dressing table, and with a gentle lift of her wrist, her maid would anoint her pulse points with ambergris or musk. A dab behind the ears, a stroke across the collarbone. Drops added to the hem of her linen shift and rubbed into her sleeves, where the scent would waft as she walked. Civet, a musk extracted from the glands of animals, was prized for its ability to mask body odor, but it carried a sharp, earthy smell of its own, something sour and musky, which lingered in the air long after the woman had left the room. To modern noses it would seem foul. To courtiers accustomed to worse, it was divine. Floral scents were softer, but they faded too quickly for those who needed their bodies disguised throughout the long hours of an audience, a banquet, or a formal dance. Rosewater was popular, distilled from entire gardens of petals. Jasmine, imported at great expense, was saved for special occasions. But the most powerful perfumes were almost animal in nature, dark and clinging, with a heaviness that sank into fabric and skin alike. And they had to be strong, for they were not being layered over clean skin, but over the residue of days, sometimes weeks, of sweat, dust, and the natural oils of an unwashed body. These perfumes did not cleanse. They covered. They competed with the smell of decaying teeth, with the sour tang of tightly bound breasts, with the stagnant dampness that lingered under skirts that brushed dirty floors and never saw the light. The perfumes mingled with these odors, twisted around them, and formed something new, not exactly pleasant, not exactly unpleasant, but unmistakably regal. The scent of a queen, they said, was unlike anything else. And they were right. The use of perfume extended beyond the body. Royal chambers were doused with scented waters. Carpets and curtains were sprinkled with rose and lavender. Gloves were soaked in orange blossom, and handkerchiefs were perfumed with violet. Even letters were often folded with dried petals or sealed with wax infused with aromatic oils. But none of this was intended to delight the senses. It was a buffer, a smoke screen, a fragile wall against the ever-present odor of bodies that could not, would not, be bathed. 4 queens, whose public presence was constant, and whose private needs were hidden behind layers of etiquette and expectation, perfume became part of their very identity. A young noblewoman might be remembered not for her words, but for the trail of scent she left as she walked through the palace halls. Courtiers would speak of her presence lingering in a room, even after she had gone, But what lingered was the perfume, soaked into the air like invisible ink. It clung to furniture. It sank into the drapes. It seeped into the pillows of the royal bed, mingling with the odors of night sweat and stale powder. And yet, behind all this olfactory grandeur was a kind of desperation, a quiet knowing that the body beneath the perfume was not pristine, a knowing that no matter how many drops of violet or civet were applied, they could never erase the truth of the flesh. It was not only about the fear of disease, though that fear was real. It was about the idea that royalty should not smell like the people they ruled. The poor bathed in rivers. The servants scrubbed their arms with rough cloth. But queens were too pure to need such vulgar things. Or so they were told. But inside the royal chambers, there were days when even the perfumes began to fail. Days of summer heat, when the air grew thick and heavy, and no amount of rosewater could disguise the rising odor beneath the gowns. Days of sickness, when the scent of vomit or infected wounds overwhelmed even the most potent of oils. On those days, even the queen might wrinkle her nose, and even the maid, loyal, silent, practiced, might flinch as she lifted another silk petticoat soaked with sweat. Still, no bath was drawn. Still, the perfume was reapplied. The mask, once cracked, had to be repaired quickly, for the next audience, the next ball, the next portrait sitting. And so it went, day after day, year after year, scent layered upon scent, memory layered upon memory. The perfumes became history themselves, woven into the stories of queens who reigned without ever truly cleansing the skin they ruled in. And in the end, it was easier to add another vial to the tray, to uncork yet another blend of jasmine and civet, than to face the basin of water, still cold, dangerous, that waited quietly in the corner, untouched. Because to bathe meant risk, but to perfume, that meant survival. And that was enough, until it wasn't. Water, still and shimmering in a silver basin at the edge of the chamber, often looked more like an ornament than an invitation. It caught the candlelight in its quiet ripples and rested untouched, cool as moonlight and just as remote. And for all its apparent beauty, it was not something to be trusted. To the royal women of ages past, water was not cleansing, it was treacherous. Its coolness was not refreshing but dangerous. Its clarity deceptive. And though it was the very substance of life, it was also, in the minds of physicians and queens alike, the silent bearer of death. The fear of water, particularly for bathing, was no superstition born in ignorance, but a belief carefully passed down through the corridors of power, reinforced by the words of learned men who studied stars and humors and balance in the body. These physicians, their robes trimmed with fur and their fingers stained with ink, wrote solemn warnings about what water could do to the human form. Water, they claimed, opened the pores. And when the pores were open, the body was defenseless. Through those invisible gateways, foul airs could enter, bad vapors from the world beyond, miasmas that carried plague and rot and fevers that left skin blistered and black. Better, then, to keep the skin sealed. Better to remain dry and layered, powdered and perfumed. The body must be protected, not exposed, especially for women whose flesh was thought to be more delicate, more porous, more vulnerable to corruption. A queen's skin, pale and smooth, was to be cherished, and never, if it could be helped, made wet. There were baths, of course, in the palaces, great marble tubs sunk into floors, lined with tiles, sometimes filled with rose petals for ceremony or spectacle. But they were rarely used, and when they were, it was more often by royal men than by women. A queen might bathe once a month, or once every few months, depending on her country, her court, her physicians. And even then, the bath would be a carefully controlled event. Tepid water, short duration, followed by swift drying with cloths warmed by the hearth. And always, the windows closed, the air still, to prevent the evil vapors from slipping in. More often, cleaning came in the form of dry washing, cloths dipped in wine or herbal infusions, gently rubbed across the skin to lift away sweat and perfume and whatever else clung to the flesh. This was done by attendants, usually in silence, with care and modesty. No one spoke of the smells. No one acknowledged the sores or rashes that sometimes bloomed beneath tightly laced garments. These things were hidden beneath gowns and bodices, concealed beneath the illusion of elegance. And still, the basin remained, always close, always present, like a symbol of what could be but never was. The fear of bathing was not limited to the palace. It was part of the very structure of society. Across Europe, public bathhouses had once been common, lively places where people gathered not only to clean but to socialize. But by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, these places fell out of favor, condemned by both doctors and clergy as dens of disease and moral decay. The plague, which swept again and again through cities and towns, was said to thrive in steam and water. Better to be dry. Better to be covered. Better to be safe. For noblewomen, this fear became law. A young princess, newly betrothed and brought to a foreign court, would be taught these customs as surely as she learned which fork to use or how to curtsy before a king. She would be warned not to bathe too often, lest her strength be sapped or her womb chilled. She would learn to endure the itch and ache of an unwashed body beneath layers of silk. And she would come to accept the ritual of perfuming as a daily act of preservation, not of health, but of illusion. Some queens resisted, quietly. There are stories, whispered through history, of royal women who craved water's embrace, who stole moments alone to dip their feet in a basin or sponge their faces behind drawn curtains. But these moments were rare and dangerous. A queen who bathed too often risked being labeled strange, unwise, even unclean, for in the twisted logic of the age, the very act of seeking cleanliness was itself a sign of impurity. And so the water waited. It filled bowls and sat untouched. It gathered dust along its surface, while the women it was meant for went about their days in sweat and perfume and silence. Physicians continued to write their treatises. Clergy gave sermons on modesty and restraint. And the idea of bathing, true, full bathing, remained locked behind centuries of caution. Even in childbirth, when a woman's body was torn and bloodied, when sweat poured freely and pain made modesty irrelevant, even then, water was used sparingly. Warm cloths might be applied. Herbal infusions might be dabbed along the forehead. But a full bath, too dangerous. The womb was open. The body was weak. The air was thick with the breath of others. One wrong draught, one moment of wet skin exposed to bad air, and death might follow. Better to lie still, unwashed, and wait for the danger to pass. And when sickness did come, as it often did, the treatment was rarely cleansing. Leeches, purgatives, bloodletting, these were the trusted tools. But washing, That remained suspicious. Even in death, the body of a queen might be sponged lightly with wine, but never immersed. The same fears that haunted life followed her into the afterlife, shaping how she was laid to rest. This fear of water endured for generations. It shaped how palaces were built, how bedrooms were furnished, how servants were trained. It shaped the bodies of women who bore its burden, and the minds of men who claimed it was wisdom. And though science would one day rise to challenge it, for now it held firm, a quiet truth hidden beneath the glitter of the crown. And so the perfume remained, stronger than reason, and the gowns remained, heavier than comfort, and the water, always just within reach, remained untouched, a mirror reflecting a world that feared its own reflection. Until eventually, something else began to change. For not only the body was kept beneath those layers, the clothes, the powder, the perfume. Beneath it all was something else, something quiet and unseen, waiting to be noticed. Because what they feared most was not the water, but what the water might reveal. The fabric was not merely worn. It was lived in, layered, pressed, laced, and sewn until it became less of a garment and more of a second skin, one that did not breathe, did not yield, did not come off at night like a familiar robe waiting at the edge of a bed. For the women of the royal court, especially those highest in rank and most visible to the watching eyes of ambassadors, noblemen, and servants alike, clothing was not a choice but an armor. Not in the sense of protection against steel, but against scrutiny, against imperfection, against the suggestion that beneath the gown was a body that sweat, ached, itched, and excreted like every other woman who was not dressed in silk and status. And so these gowns, ornate and impossibly heavy, were often worn for weeks, sometimes even months, without being removed. They were not designed for daily wear in the way modern garments are. They were structured, boned, padded, and embroidered in ways that required the hands of several attendants to assemble, as if the queen or duchess were a sculpture to be constructed each morning, rather than a human being preparing to begin her day. Once she was laced into her bodice, her sleeves sewn to the lining, and her underskirts carefully pinned, the process of removal became so burdensome that it simply did not happen, not unless it absolutely had to. A gown could weigh more than a child, its weight distributed in brocade, velvet, and layers of petticoats that swept the floor behind her in a trail of silent authority. The tightness of the bodice was no accident. It cinched the waist not only to conform to the fashionable silhouette, but also to remind the woman inside it that her body was not her own. Her breath was restricted, her movements measured. To sit required assistance. To stand for hours, as she often must during court ceremonies or royal meals, was not merely tiring, it was agonizing. But even then, she remained composed, poised, radiant to those watching. What they did not see, what they could not see, was what happened beneath the gown. The linen shift, the single layer meant to protect the skin from the outer garments, grew dark with sweat and yellowed with oils from the skin. It clung to her like a damp whisper. It seemed stiff with grime after days of wear. It was rarely changed, for the process of undressing was too involved to perform frequently. And so, the shift became a repository of scent and filth, never scrubbed, only perfumed and aired out at best. The bodice, often sewn shut once donned, remained in place not just overnight but for weeks. And within that enclosed space, heat and moisture built up. Rashes formed beneath the breasts. Sores developed on the shoulders. where the weight of the fabric pressed into the skin. Fungal infections festered in the folds of skin that never saw sunlight. And through it all, the woman smiled, curtsied, and performed. Her suffering was private, invisible, carefully wrapped in silk. The sleeves were sometimes stitched directly to the gown or even to the shift underneath. This ensured that the entire ensemble moved as one, elegant, seamless, continuous. But it also meant that movement was restricted. Scratching an itch beneath a sewn sleeve was impossible. Changing posture without tugging the stitching was a risk. And any attempt to remove the garment prematurely could damage it, a luxury no lady could afford, especially when garments were painstakingly tailored, expensive, and often reused across seasons or events. Even urination posed a challenge. Some gowns included slits through which the wearer could squat or relieve herself over a chamber pot without fully undressing. But these slits did not offer comfort or cleanliness. They were functional, and only barely so. Linen undergarments absorbed what they could, and the rest was left to dry on the skin or within the fabric, masked later by perfume and powder. It was not uncommon for women to suffer from urinary infections, itching, and a general sense of constant dampness, problems they could not speak of, let alone treat with ease. The process of undressing, when it did finally occur, was often ceremonial, save for occasions such as childbirth, illness, or complete change of wardrobe. It was then that the gown would be carefully unstitched, the laces undone, the shift peeled away from skin that sometimes bled as the fabric lifted away the layers of built-up filth. The smell, according to some attendants who left written records, could be overwhelming. Not because the women were unclean by nature, but because the body, sealed for so long, denied the air and the sun and the relief of a washcloth, had begun to ferment under the weight of fashion and expectation. Still, the garments were praised. Portraits depicted them in exquisite detail, every fold and pearl carefully recorded. To see a queen in such a gown was to witness power. To touch it was an honor. But to wear it, day after day, without reprieve, without washing, without comfort, that was the silent suffering that every royal woman knew but never named. There were, on occasion, exceptions. Queens who insisted on being unstitched at night, who bathed in warm wine or herbal infusions once a month, who changed their underlayers more frequently. But they were rare, and often regarded as eccentric or indulgent. The norm was endurance. The norm was sacrifice. To dress like royalty meant to suffer like royalty, with a smile, with perfume, and with the quiet dignity of one who knew that her body was not entirely her own. And when the time came to don a new gown, it was not with relief, but with a kind of resignation. For the process would begin again, the lacing, the stitching, the pinning. The fresh fabric would be stiff, the new shift tight, and the old one, removed at last, would be hung to air out by a window, its yellowed edges fluttering gently in the breeze, as if whispering of all it had absorbed and all it had concealed. The gown was no longer clothing. It was a prison disguised as pageantry, a burden woven into beauty, a second skin that allowed no breath, no freedom, no truth. And beneath it, the body longed for something it would rarely receive, the simple sensation of soap, of water, of fresh air across bare skin. But that, too, was dangerous. And so the layers remained. And beneath them, infection quietly bloomed, pressing itself into the folds where beauty dared not look. though they bathed rarely and the concept of soap as we know it today remained largely unknown. Another troubling aspect of royal hygiene, one that lingered heavily in the silken air of courtly chambers, was the complete absence of effective dental care, a reality that affected not only the poor but, quite dramatically, the aristocratic elite as well, particularly the royal women who often were expected to maintain delicate smiles despite the quiet agony festering within their mouths. While the faces of queens and duchesses were painted with soft blushes and scented powders in an effort to mask the natural signs of aging and exhaustion, the teeth behind their genteel smiles told a far more gruesome story, one that began in childhood and followed them into their later years like a loyal but painful companion, each bite a reminder that even the most privileged were not immune to decay. From the earliest years of a noblewoman's life, sweetmeats, candied fruits, and wines steeped in honey were served with great regularity, considered signs of wealth and refinement in courtly banquets. These delicacies, though delightful on the tongue, served as slow-acting poisons to the teeth, rotting them away under layers of sugar and neglect. Oral hygiene, in the form of toothbrushes or even regular rinsing, was virtually unknown, and where crude cleaning attempts were made, they often did more harm than good. Women might chew on twigs or rub ashes and crushed salt onto their gums, believing these coarse materials could scour the decay away. In truth, such practices only abraded the enamel and inflamed the gums further, leaving mouths raw, infected, and increasingly malodorous. The breath of royal women, no matter how perfumed their clothes or how fragrant the bouquets of herbs carried by handmaidens, was often fetid with the smell of decaying molars, gum disease, and festering abscesses. It was not uncommon for upper-class women to have teeth pulled not by trained dentists, who were rare and often distrusted, but by barbers or general physicians, whose tools were as unsanitized as their knowledge. Pliers used to extract a tooth might be the same ones used to clip toenails or trim wigs, and with no understanding of germs or sterilization, infections following extractions were both common and severe. Some women developed septicemia, a silent killer that could begin with a simple toothache and end with a pale, fevered death weeks later, her symptoms dismissed as weakness or hysteria. Even queens were not spared these indignities. Records from the Tudor court suggest that Queen Elizabeth I, for all her regal bearing and commanding presence, suffered severely from tooth decay in her later years. Contemporary accounts noted the blackness of her teeth and the pain she endured, although it was often masked beneath layers of heavy makeup and a refusal to open her mouth in public. It is believed that Elizabeth had teeth extracted over time, but without the benefit of anesthesia or antiseptics, the procedures must have been excruciating. Her meals, once elaborate, reportedly shifted to softer foods that required little chewing, a quiet adaptation to a painful reality that was, at the time, seen as a natural part of aging, regardless of rank. To cover the unsightliness of missing or decaying teeth, some royal women wore false dental pieces crafted from ivory, bone, or even the teeth of the poor, purchased by physicians or stolen from graveyards and reassembled into rudimentary dentures. These early dental contraptions were held in place with wires and cloth, uncomfortable and often more decorative than functional, rarely fitting well and sometimes causing further irritation or infections. And because these artificial teeth were not cleaned, they often became embedded with food, turning what was meant to be a cosmetic solution into yet another source of stench and discomfort. As courtship and marriage were central to a noblewoman's destiny, appearance mattered greatly. Women were expected to smile demurely at potential suitors, to appear healthy and vibrant even when their gums throbbed with infection and their mouths bled at night. Some found ways to conceal the damage, holding scented handkerchiefs near their mouths or avoiding certain foods at banquets, feigning modesty or religious fasting. But behind the scenes, handmaidens were sometimes tasked with dabbing tinctures onto swollen gums or applying clove oil in the hopes of dulling relentless pain, a medieval solution that provided only the briefest respite from a suffering that had no cure. And yet, despite all this, teeth were seen not as a matter of health but of fate. Rotting teeth were blamed on humoral imbalances or inherited weakness rather than sugar or neglect. Royal physicians, still clinging to Galenic theories, might prescribe a change in diet, a bloodletting, or a prayerful pilgrimage rather than cleaning, caution, or preventive care. Thus, the cycle continued, generation after generation of women who smiled through clenched jaws, who endured abscesses and extractions in silence, and who, more often than not, found themselves retreating from social life as the pain and shame grew unbearable. Even in the grandest palaces, amid velvet drapes and golden goblets, the royal mouth remained a place of decay. The scent of roses may have drifted from the gardens below, and musicians may have played softly in candlelit halls, but within the jaws of queens and duchesses, rot and ruin brewed silently, a quiet testament to the truth that no amount of wealth or lineage could spare one from the consequences of neglect, ignorance, and the misguided elegance of a sugar-coated age. And as these women aged, drawing further into the shadows of their chambers and away from the mirrors that once reflected youth, the pain endured in silence became just another element of royal decorum, one more secret kept behind closed doors, buried beneath silks, crowns, and closed lips. But of course, teeth were only one part of a greater picture, and if the inside of the mouth harbored such hidden rot, then what, one might ask, of the hidden world below the waist, a place equally subject to misunderstanding, myth, and unspeakable customs passed from mother to daughter, all wrapped in the quiet expectation that discomfort, and even agony, was simply a woman's lot in life, even for those who wore a crown? In the flickering candlelit solitude of chambers draped in velvet and silk, where perfumes tried vainly to conquer the stubborn musk of sweat and stale linens, the presence of lice was not an occasional nuisance but an intimate and perennial companion, burrowed deep into the very seams of royal existence. Lice, so small yet so utterly pervasive, crept across the bodies and scalps of queens, princesses, and their ladies-in-waiting with impunity, undeterred by wealth, lineage, or the heavy scent of rosewater. In an age before the humble invention of modern shampoo or insecticide, these crawling creatures found ideal refuge within the towering wigs, padded headdresses, and elaborately coiled hairstyles that were considered emblems of noble elegance. A royal lady's coiffure could remain untouched for weeks at a time, painstakingly sculpted by tireless attendants and left to sit like a crown of social expectation upon her scalp, gradually turning into a nesting ground for lice and their sticky, pearl-like eggs, which clung to the hair shafts like morning dew on a spider's web. Within these structures of style and status, lice thrived quietly, burrowing into the scalp to draw blood, their bites leaving behind small red welts and incessant itching, an invisible torment concealed beneath layers of artifice and social formality. The scratching, of course, could not be done openly. To acknowledge the presence of lice, even through a momentary lapse of poise, would have been to admit the failure of one's attendants, one's household, and ultimately, one's image of controlled refinement. So the discomfort was borne in silence, masked by subtle gestures, the occasional shudder, or the carefully timed tilt of the head. Servants, especially the low-ranking maids tasked with grooming duties, often combed through their mistress's hair with long, slender ivory or bone combs in search of nits, a process both tedious and shameful. There were remedies, of course, though none particularly effective. Herbal infusions of rosemary or pennyroyal were steeped and cooled before being poured over the scalp, their pungent scents offering brief relief but rarely eradicating the infestation entirely. Powdered mercury, too, was sometimes applied, despite its known toxicity, as were concoctions of vinegar, soot, and lard, a mixture that did more to soil the pillow than cleanse the head. And yet, even these extreme measures were reserved for more desperate cases, because such treatments threatened the integrity of the towering wigs and intricate braids that had taken hours, sometimes days, to fashion into place. It was not uncommon for these wigs to be set aside only once a fortnight or even less, removed under great ceremony and with visible reluctance. Beneath them, the real hair was often matted, greasy, and alive with movement, the scalp red and inflamed from bites, the stench sharp and human, a stark contrast to the floral oils and fragrant sachets stuffed into the curls of the wig above. Even noblewomen sleeping on satin pillows embroidered with gold thread could not escape the crawling reality beneath their crowns of hair. The lice followed them from chamber to court and from banquet to bedroom, a silent, writhing reminder that no amount of lace or lace-trimmed modesty could truly separate them from the baser facts of the body. Some attempted to freeze the lice out during winter by setting their wigs near open windows or burying their bedclothes in snow. Others tried the opposite approach. Steam, sulphurous smoke, or hot irons passed carefully over combs in an effort to kill the creatures by heat. But lice, hardy and stubborn, persisted through each new technique, adapting as easily as the courtiers themselves did to shifting politics and seasonal court fashions. Even the most revered of queens, preserved in oil portraits and marble statues, endured the ceaseless irritation of these intruders. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, was reputed to douse her head in various waters and tinctures to fight infestations, though whether this offered real relief or merely moved the lice further down her elaborate hairpieces is uncertain. Queen Elizabeth I, beneath her famously flame-red wigs, likely battled similar afflictions, the pale powder coating her face doing nothing to repel the colonies of lice that would have made her scalp their permanent home. Lice, it seemed, held no regard for royal blood or divine right. They feasted indiscriminately, spreading from head to head as easily as whispers of court gossip. And so, even as elegant music echoed through marble halls and courtiers bowed low in reverence, lice moved unseen through the folds of brocade and beneath the gems of diadems, living a parallel life amidst the splendor and ceremony of high-born existence. The most skilled ladies' sometimes grew adept at detecting the telltale signs before their mistresses uttered a word: the slight stiffness at the back of the neck, the subconscious reach toward the temple, the subtle shudder when bending forward. In private, they might speak in coded language about feverish scalps or restless nights, indicating a new wave of infestation had begun. And with that, the cycle of treatment, or what passed for it, would begin anew. Wigs would be removed under protest, garments laundered with harsh ash soap, and linen head wraps replaced daily, though rarely with lasting effect. The lice always returned, persistent and unseen, as much a part of palace life as the tapestries on the wall or the goblets at the feast. They were a truth never spoken aloud, especially not by the noblewomen themselves, who maintained their composure through it all, smiling and nodding, their scalps aflame, their skin crawling, their thoughts perhaps drifting to dreams of cool water and shaved heads, indulgences they could never dare voice aloud. And thus, in a world where luxury was measured by the complexity of one's attire and the height of one's hair, these tiny, wingless insects defied the pomp with impunity, reminding every royal lady that for all the layers of silk and social elevation, there remained something primal beneath, something that no status could quite suppress, and no amount of powder could truly mask. And it was perhaps in that silent, shared discomfort, that private knowledge, where royal women found one of their few, if unspoken, commonalities, a shared vulnerability tucked beneath ribbons and pearls. Still, they pressed forward, attending court, receiving ambassadors, posing for portraits, the lice crawling beneath their crowns all the while, undisturbed by dignity. Yet, as troubling as lice were, they were merely the surface of the royal body's afflictions, one of many unspoken torments that quietly festered behind the veil of elegance. For deeper still, behind the rouge, the brocade, the painted veneers, lay matters even more intimate, even more difficult to address, and even more entwined with silence. It was in the body's secret tides, in the rhythms of blood and birth and loss, that the next realm of royal hygiene began to take its toll. The burden of ceremonial beauty, carried like a crown of thorns behind layers of powdered pride, weighed heavily on the shoulders of royal women, who could not simply be present. They had to perform a type of femininity that was scripted, rigid, and dangerously misunderstood. Nowhere was this more evident than in the use of cosmetics and beautification rituals, which, while outwardly appearing elegant or opulent, were underpinned by practices that would horrify modern standards of hygiene and personal care. To sit in front of a gilded mirror in the dimly lit corridors of a royal chamber was not to casually apply a touch of color or line the eyes in flirtation. It was to begin a process of slow bodily betrayal, one subtle smudge or powder at a time, with each application bringing its own risks, its own discomforts, its own steady unraveling of skin and health. The cosmetics of the pre-modern courts, especially in European realms during the late Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance and Baroque periods, were frequently concocted from dangerous, caustic materials. White lead, mercury, and arsenic being among the most favored, all in service of crafting that pale, ghostly, porcelain visage that became the coveted symbol of wealth and nobility. The logic was clear but cruel. Tanned skin suggested labor, exposure to the sun, and therefore lower social standing, while paleness conveyed fragility, idleness, and thus an elevated, noble detachment from the world of work and toil. And so, day after day, royal women dusted and daubed their faces with powders so fine and ghostly they lingered in the breath, slipping into lungs with every inhale. These lead-based concoctions not only dried out the skin, but also caused ulcers, inflammation, and long-term disfigurement, leading to even more desperate reliance on further layers of makeup to conceal the wounds created by the previous day's regimen. The skin began to break apart, yet the expectations remained unbroken. Beauty had to be preserved, even as the flesh beneath it wilted. This brutal ritual was not confined only to the face. Women whitened their bosoms, arms, and necks, ensuring that even areas rarely revealed were kept to that ghost-like pallor, lest they be judged wanting. The use of ceruse, an infamous mixture of white lead and vinegar, was common across courts like those of Elizabethan England and Bourbon France. It would crack as it dried, forming a mask that turned living skin into a brittle, chalky sculpture. To maintain its appearance, the surface had to be retouched repeatedly throughout the day, sometimes layered upon previous coatings without ever fully washing the skin beneath. Bathing, as discussed before, was rare, and so the makeup festered, mixed with sweat, dirt, and oil, often attracting insects and contributing to severe skin infections that slowly ate away at the user's health. Yet to appear in public without it was unthinkable, a breach of dignity, an admission of decline, an aesthetic defeat. Alongside the face, the eyes, lips, and hairline bore the brunt of unnatural treatments. Belladonna, derived from the deadly nightshade plant, was dropped into the eyes to create a wide, dilated gaze thought to be alluring, yet it caused blurred vision, dryness, and over time, permanent damage to the retina. Red ochre or vermilion, often laced with mercury, was applied to the cheeks and lips, giving that illusion of vitality while poisoning the bloodstream from within. And to achieve a high, noble forehead, women would pluck or shave their front hairlines, sometimes so excessively that the follicles ceased to regrow, leaving a permanently altered appearance that had to be maintained endlessly. The ritual was meticulous and repetitive, but devoid of true cleansing. Layers built upon layers, each masking decay, each suppressing the natural body, each step a deeper entrenchment into the cycle of appearance over well-being. It was not only the body that suffered. The rooms in which these cosmetic ceremonies unfolded were themselves hazards to health. The air grew thick with powders and metallic scents. Mirrors, rare and expensive, reflected not a true self but the version dictated by fashion, protocol, and male fantasy. The ladies-in-waiting who assisted their queens and duchesses were also exposed to these substances, often suffering the same consequences despite their lesser rank. And because these cosmetic materials were considered precious, they were stored and reused across months, sometimes shared, sometimes altered with makeshift additions, but rarely scrutinized for spoilage or contamination. The same powder puff that had collected sweat and skin cells weeks ago would be brought out again, tapping its ghostly burden onto yet another already bruised cheek. What made these practices even more insidious was the cultural silence that surrounded their effects. A royal woman was not to complain of blemishes or rashes. She was not to comment on the ulcers forming behind her ears or the sudden loss of eyelashes. If her hair thinned or fell out, she would simply adorn it with wigs or elaborate headdresses. If her skin began to sag or develop sores, she would double her layer of lead powder and reapply rouge with an unflinching hand. Over time, many of these women grew sickly, their bodies reacting to the daily intake of poison, their organs slowly failing under the strain. And yet, the cause was often misunderstood or ignored entirely, attributed to female weakness or divine punishment rather than the very rituals of beautification they had been expected to endure. In the most tragic cases, royal women would continue applying these cosmetic preparations even from their sickbeds, ensuring that death would not find them anything less than porcelain perfect. The worst irony, perhaps, lay in the fact that these beauty standards, these disfiguring, deadly routines, were rarely designed by women themselves. They were imposed, reinforced, and idealized by the courtly male gaze, by artists, poets, kings, and philosophers who described and immortalized the ideal woman as pale, hairless, passive, and eternally youthful. And so, royal women became both prisoners and practitioners of this illusion, their beauty a battlefield where health, dignity, and reality were sacrificed for the sake of appearance. Even in old age, they were not permitted escape. Powdered wigs, false teeth, and heavy rouge were deployed to simulate the bloom of youth, turning elderly queens into caricatures of their former selves, still entangled in a lie that began in the mirror and ended, often, in an early grave. As the century turned and medical knowledge crept forward in hesitant steps, there were whispers of the dangers behind these rituals. Physicians cautioned against the use of lead and mercury, but the warnings were often too late or too weak to counter the inertia of tradition and vanity. And even when newer, less harmful ingredients were proposed, they were slow to take root in the palace walls. 4 habits, once gilded in royal expectation, were difficult to change, especially when they were passed down like heirlooms from mother to daughter, generation to generation, a legacy of painted suffering wrapped in silk and powdered with ash. And so, with their bodies quietly rebelling and their skin bearing the cost of appearance, royal women would move from their dressing tables to the grand halls, smiling beneath the weight of their artificial glow, surrounded by incense and candles, unaware, or perhaps all too aware, that the rituals they performed in pursuit of perfection were slowly draining the life from their bones. Yet even in this painted decay, there remained no reprieve, for another realm of suffering awaited them beyond the chamber's door, one that tied cleanliness not to makeup, but to the deeper, more neglected parts of the female body. And so it was that their beauty regimens, already so deeply rooted in a culture of discomfort and danger, gave way to the far murkier world of bodily sanitation, or rather, the conspicuous lack thereof, where perceptions of purity were far more metaphorical than physical, and where daily washing was often seen not only as unnecessary, but as something to be regarded with suspicion and restraint, particularly for women of noble birth, whose delicate constitutions were said to be at risk from the sudden shock of cold water upon their skin, or worse still, from the imagined invasions of unseen vapors and bad humors believed to enter the body through moist pores left open by bathing, beliefs that had been handed down for generations, and which persisted despite the contradictory whispers of foreign travelers and learned physicians who brought strange tales of cleaner habits from distant lands. For these women of rank and reputation, many of whom lived in great palaces where fountains flowed and marble tubs remained mostly ornamental, the act of full-body bathing was something reserved for moments of great need or sacred ritual, perhaps once a month, or during the recovery from childbirth, rather than as a daily act of health, and so the grime of daily existence was neither scrubbed nor rinsed away, but instead layered over with powders, perfumes, and heavy fabrics that disguised the scent of stale sweat, or attempted to, though the effort often produced only a more pungent mix of floral oils and human musk that lingered in the folds of velvet gowns and in the feathered canopies of their beds, which were rarely aired or stripped, but instead layered in silks and brocades that trapped the odors of the body like incense in a cathedral. Their reluctance to bathe was not born entirely from laziness or extravagance, but rather from a long-standing fear of water itself, a suspicion rooted in the medieval notion that water opened the skin and weakened the body's natural defenses, a theory supported by church teachings which often portrayed the body as something inherently shameful, to be covered and concealed rather than washed and celebrated. And so, in the minds of many, especially women raised in cloisters or courtly chambers, the act of undressing for a bath carried not only the physical risk of chills and imbalance, but a moral weight as well, for the naked body was seen as a vessel of temptation, a source of sin, and to reveal it, even to oneself, invited spiritual peril. The rare occasions when a woman of the court did bathe were often heavily ritualized affairs, supervised by handmaidens and sometimes even observed by curious courtiers, particularly if the lady in question held power or favor, and these baths might involve warmed water infused with herbs or wine, poured into ornately carved tubs lined with cloth to prevent the chill of porcelain or stone, but more often than not, these efforts were interrupted, rushed, or avoided entirely, especially in the colder months when the firewood required to heat water became more precious, and the fear of catching a deadly chill increased with each bitter wind. Instead of bathing, royal women relied on an elaborate system of surface cleaning, a method both time-consuming and largely ineffective, involving linen cloths soaked in rosewater or vinegar, which were dabbed behind the ears, along the neck, and under the arms, though rarely anywhere lower, and though such cloths gave a brief sensation of cleanliness, they did little to remove the oils, dirt, and dead skin that accumulated day after day beneath corsets, farthingales, and heavy underskirts, and thus the body became a patchwork of fragrant dabs and hidden filth, an illusion of hygiene maintained only through distance, and one that quickly dissolved when proximity made the truth undeniable. In such conditions, the skin suffered, prone to rashes, boils, and infestations that were treated not with medicine or soap, but with concoctions of crushed pearls, egg whites, or lead-based ointments, which further damaged the skin and poisoned the body slowly, leading many noblewomen to age prematurely or suffer inexplicable ailments that baffled their physicians and were often blamed on spirits, bad air, or melancholic temperaments. Their undergarments, too, reflected this disinterest in true cleanliness, for though linen chemises were sometimes changed with some regularity, they were rarely washed thoroughly, and many a fine lady would go weeks, even months, without laundering her garments properly, relying instead on sunlight or scented sachets to refresh the cloth, while bodily fluids, menstrual stains, and everyday perspiration were simply endured or masked with additional layers, creating a veritable cocoon of filth that followed them from bedchamber to ballroom, and which even their closest companions learned to ignore. So deeply had society trained them to equate nobility with refinement, regardless of the odor that clung to a duchess's glove or the trail of lice that sometimes traced the nape of her powdered neck. What's more, the beds in which they slept were not the clean sanctuaries one might imagine when picturing royal luxury, but rather intricate traps of disease and discomfort, for though adorned with lace, embroidery, and velvet, these beds were rarely cleaned beyond the occasional shaking of sheets or brushing of crumbs, and many were infested with bedbugs and fleas, whose bites were blamed on demons or humors, not on the layers of dirt and human residue that coated the mattresses over years of use. And it was not uncommon for a queen or countess to sleep in a bed that had once belonged to her predecessor, inheriting not only the title but the lice and sweat-stained linens of generations past, a continuity of uncleanliness masked by pomp and perfume. This approach to hygiene, of course, was not exclusive to women, for their male counterparts were often equally filthy, yet it was women who bore the brunt of judgment and contradiction, expected to be both ethereal and obedient, dainty and desirable, without ever fully engaging in the bodily realities that came with womanhood, and so the expectation of appearing flawless without the means to properly cleanse oneself led to ever more elaborate and harmful methods of cosmetic masking, a cycle that deepened with each generation, especially as court fashions grew more complex and layered, trapping more heat, more moisture, and more bacteria beneath their seams. Servants, of course, bore the task of cleaning whatever could be cleaned, combs, ribbons, petticoats, but they too worked within the same limited understanding of sanitation, and often used tools that were themselves infested, such as brushes shared among many or water reused across multiple tasks, so that even the semblance of hygiene was contaminated from the start, and so the court, for all its sparkle and pageantry, functioned less like a place of refinement and more like a gilded shell, housing a slow, relentless rot. Yet despite all this, these royal women continued to play their roles with elegance and grace, smiling beneath their powdered faces, gesturing with gloved hands that had not touched water in weeks, dancing in halls that stank of sweat masked with ambergris, and entertaining ambassadors who bowed before them while silently holding their breath. For in the theater of monarchy, illusion was everything, and the illusion of purity, beauty, and health was maintained not through actual cleanliness, but through sheer performance, a performance whose consequences would grow more severe as medical understanding slowly advanced and began to reveal the extent of damage such practices had wrought. And in the next chamber of their lives, beyond the perfumes and powder, lay the delicate matter of their monthly cycles, how they were managed, misunderstood, and mistreated within the constraints of royal decorum and medical ignorance. Even as the elaborate gowns and jewel-laden headdresses of the court shimmered under torchlight and candle glow, their outward glamour often concealed an inward rot that touched not only the body but the very breath that carried their voices. One of the most whispered but most offensive of these concealed hygienic failings was the near-total disregard for oral hygiene among royal women of earlier centuries. In an age before toothpaste, toothbrushes, or any real understanding of bacteria and decay, the royal mouth was not always a place of refined smiles and pearly rows of teeth. Instead, it was often a cavern of rot, of aching gums, of blackened molars clinging to diseased roots, held together more by desperation than bone. The stench that arose from such mouths, sweetened only momentarily by cloves or crushed mint leaves, was often unbearable, a truth never mentioned aloud in courtly company, but often noted in the private letters and scandalous diaries that whispered truths too shameful for the court. Royal women, despite their wealth and supposed refinement, had little recourse when it came to maintaining dental cleanliness. Toothbrushes, as we would recognize them, had not yet become commonplace, and so most noblewomen, if they did anything at all, resorted to crude tools like frayed linen cloths soaked in wine, vinegar, or urine. Yes, even urine, for it was mistakenly believed to have medicinal properties. With these cloths, they would rub at their teeth, hoping to cleanse away the remnants of meat stews, wine, and sugar-laced sweets that lodged themselves between teeth like uninvited guests refusing to leave. Some, taking cues from herbal remedies passed down through female servants or aging midwives, chewed on twigs of aromatic wood like birch or hazel, hoping the fibrous strands might scrape away decay or that the oils might mask the odor seeping from their infected gums. But such practices were sporadic, unsystematic, and grounded more in desperation than science. Perhaps even more tragic was the increasing presence of sugar in the diet of the aristocracy, particularly after it became a luxury commodity traded from distant colonies. Royal women, unburdened by physical labor and surrounded by constant feasts, were often encouraged to indulge in sugar confections that symbolized both wealth and status. Candied violets, marzipan sculptures, honey-drenched pastries, these delicacies were as dangerous to the mouth as they were delightful to the eye. Consumed daily and without any proper means of cleaning the teeth afterward, they contributed to widespread tooth decay among the nobility. It became so common, in fact, that blackened teeth were not only accepted but at times even mimicked. Artificial stains were occasionally applied to match the aesthetic of royal decay, especially in societies where the appearance of indulgence mattered more than actual health. In the grand portrait halls of Versailles, in the private chambers of Vienna, in the gilded parlors of Madrid, countless royal women would smile with tightly closed lips or pose with their mouths demurely covered by fans, gloves, or lace veils, not purely out of modesty but to hide the ruin within. The breath, when unleashed, could be enough to cause a courtier to faint or a maidservant to flinch. Remedies to this issue were as strange as they were ineffective. Perfumed mouth rinses were concocted from rosewater, burnt alum, crushed pearls, or even powdered coral, ingredients that lent a fleeting sweetness but did little to combat infection. In extreme cases, royal physicians, whose understanding of dentistry was laughably rudimentary, would prescribe cauterization or the plucking out of teeth using iron tongs heated in fire to numb the pain. These extractions were done without anesthesia, of course, and the screams of royal women echoed through stone halls, muffled only by velvet pillows pressed to pale faces or the tight grip of handmaids trying to hold down a writhing body on an ornate fainting couch. There are stories, half lost in the fog of history, of queens who refused to speak in public due to the unbearable stench of their mouths, of duchesses who never kissed their lovers for fear of embarrassment, and of young princesses whose courtships were soured not by politics or rivalry but by the unspeakable condition of their breath. Diaries of foreign ambassadors occasionally mention such things in veiled phrases. Her Grace is of sweet disposition but curiously averse to close company, while servants wrote more plainly of the horrors they encountered when helping their mistresses dress each morning, describing with grim resignation the rank smell that lingered even after applications of perfume or herbal pastes. The shame surrounding such conditions was immense. To be royal was to be above reproach, to exude beauty and perfection, and yet the mouth, hidden and ungovernable, betrayed the illusion. Efforts were made to conceal the problem rather than fix it. Fans became an essential accessory not only for flirtation but for hiding the mouth. Gloves were raised not just in grace but to shield breath. Conversational distance was maintained, not merely as a mark of etiquette, but to spare others from the sour gusts of a decaying smile. It is said that one Habsburg duchess was so mortified by the state of her teeth that she trained herself to speak through gritted jaws, never opening her lips more than a sliver, even when laughing. Others resorted to elaborate headdresses and face veils that allowed them to interact at a distance or behind a veil of scent and silk. Even in death, the shame of poor oral hygiene haunted these women. Royal embalmers, tasked with preparing the bodies of queens and noble ladies for burial, would often extract decayed teeth from the corpse before it was laid to rest, fearing that the open casket display might reveal the ruin inside. Jewels were placed upon the lips, or mouths were sewn shut and veiled with lace, not for superstition or style, but out of a final, desperate attempt to preserve the illusion of grace. In some mausoleums, skulls unearthed centuries later revealed the truth: rows of blackened roots, abscesses in the jawbone, and signs of crude, agonizing extractions. Thus, even in the most gilded courts of Europe, even amidst tapestries and orchestras and the finest silks woven by the hands of artisans, the mouth of a royal woman often remained a hidden chamber of rot and ruin. The palace might be spotless, the gown immaculate, but behind the closed lips of queens and princesses, a darker truth festered, one that no perfume could mask, no painting could portray, and no title could erase. And from that silence, from that suffering, we drift onward, further into the quiet shadows of forgotten hygiene, where yet another grotesque practice awaits in the private rituals of cleanliness, or the absence thereof, in matters far more intimate than teeth. Though the opulence of courtly life often conjures visions of gilded mirrors, shimmering brocades, and lavishly perfumed salons, the royal women of centuries past were just as susceptible to the quiet decay that lingered beneath their powder-dusted skin, and nowhere did this become more apparent than in the grand yet woefully unsanitary practices of dental care, or more accurately, the disturbing lack thereof, which rendered smiles deceptive masks hiding pain, rot, and the inevitable collapse of even the most enchanting of appearances. Among royal courts, particularly those of Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods, teeth were not regarded with the importance modern minds might assume. While sparkling white smiles were often painted in portraits, in reality they were a rarity, and more often, a mouth full of decay, foul breath, and visible abscesses lurked behind the still and graceful expressions held for official court appearances. Toothbrushes, where they existed at all, were crude contraptions made from twigs, horsehair, or rough cloths, and though some noblewomen might have chewed herbs or wiped their mouths with linen in hopes of achieving freshness, these feeble measures did little against the relentless advance of plaque and infection, particularly in diets rich with sugar, a luxury, yes, but one that brought hidden ruin in every sweetened bite. Royal diets, unlike those of the commoners who gnawed on rough bread and hearty root vegetables, included generous portions of candied fruits, honey-glazed pastries, and wines infused with sweet syrups, and these treats, though symbols of status, served as quiet saboteurs of oral health, softening enamel, feeding bacterial colonies, and inviting rot into the very mouths from which royal decrees and flirtatious laughter were delivered. In many cases, the decay grew so severe that teeth blackened, loosened, and fell from royal jaws prematurely, leaving noblewomen to either hide their smiles behind fans or attempt to disguise their condition with wax fillings, which could be molded into the shape of a tooth and temporarily fixed in place, though they often slipped free during speech or laughter, creating moments of mortifying embarrassment in otherwise carefully choreographed gatherings. Perhaps worse than the visual decay was the overwhelming stench that emanated from the infected gums of noble ladies who, having been taught more about maintaining appearances than health, focused their routines on cosmetics and perfumes while neglecting the hidden hygiene that truly mattered. The stench of tooth decay was often described in letters and court memoirs not in blunt terms, but through delicate euphemisms. A lady with a heavy sweetness of breath, or a pained smile that did not last, both phrases that hinted at the ulcered gums and oozing abscesses that plagued the upper classes, many of whom suffered in silence, their suffering made worse by the belief that pain was a test of virtue or, worse still, a sign of internal corruption. Pain relief, when it came, was crude at best, involving poultices of crushed mint, vinegar rinses, or the application of powdered oyster shells, all ineffective, all unable to stem the throbbing ache of a dying nerve within a molar left to rot unchecked. When a tooth had to be pulled, the procedure was anything but clinical. The court barber or surgeon, who often lacked formal training, would force the noblewoman into a chair, pry open her mouth, and extract the tooth with iron forceps, usually without anesthesia and often resulting in broken jaws or fragments of bone being torn away in the process. Screams echoed through corridors dressed in velvet and gold, and sometimes fainting spells followed, not from delicacy but from sheer searing pain. As centuries wore on, the introduction of sugar from the New World worsened the problem, for now, even greater quantities of the crystalline enemy made their way into the diets of queens, duchesses, and ladies-in-waiting, while the knowledge of dental care remained woefully underdeveloped. Queen Elizabeth I of England, often revered for her commanding presence and legendary intellect, was reportedly afflicted with such severe tooth decay by her later years that her courtiers found it difficult to converse with her face to face, not out of fear or reverence, but due to the overwhelming odor wafting from her mouth. Her teeth, blackened and brittle, had to be painted over in white paste for public appearances, a grim irony for a ruler obsessed with appearances yet powerless against the slow disintegration of her own smile. Other royal women, desperate to preserve their image, employed servants to chew herbs and then breathe into their faces to test their freshness before public engagements, a bizarre and humiliating ritual that did little to mask the underlying decay festering within. The irony of it all, of course, was that the very same noblewomen who suffered these torments were often seen as the pinnacle of refinement and beauty in their time, worshipped in verse and immortalized in paint. Yet hidden beneath powdered cheeks and perfumed veils was a mouthful of agony that bespoke a darker truth about the glamorous illusion of courtly life. Not even gold could save them from this particular decay, though some tried, having their teeth capped or inlaid with gold to conceal blackened stubs, a practice that often made things worse by introducing foreign material into already infected gums. And so they smiled less and whispered more, hiding their mouths behind lace fans and careful gestures, avoiding wide laughter, and praying that the rot would not show. Their lips might have spoken in poetry and diplomacy, but they were lips trembling over festering wounds, voices issuing from mouths that smelled of slow ruin, while around them the court pretended not to notice, too steeped in the illusion of perfection to acknowledge the very human suffering behind it. And from this silent agony of royal breath and ruined teeth, the story flows naturally into an even more peculiar dimension of courtly hygiene, one that moved beyond the mouth and into the rituals that surrounded birth, menstruation, and the veiled horror of reproductive cleanliness, where the private pain of women was masked by superstition, wrapped in linen, and left unspoken in chambers that echoed with ceremonial prayers and whispered anxieties about purity, legacy, and blood. The presence of perfumes and scented oils in royal courts, especially among noblewomen, offered a peculiar illusion of cleanliness, masking foul odors rather than eradicating them, and contributing in their own subtle way to the widespread misunderstanding of hygiene among the upper classes. In a time before the science of germs was understood, smell itself became the enemy rather than the causes behind it, and the belief that illness traveled through foul air, miasma, led court physicians and perfumers to recommend layers of strong scents to guard the body from disease. Royal women, often forbidden or discouraged from bathing frequently for fear of opening the pores and allowing sickness to enter the body, came to rely more and more on these aromatic coverings, resulting in chambers and garments drenched in musk, rose oil, civet, ambergris, and various floral concoctions that hung heavily in the air and clung tightly to skin and cloth alike. The effect was not one of subtle elegance, as modern sensibilities might imagine, but of cloying suffocation, particularly when the natural odors of the unwashed body mingled with the thick perfumes, producing a bouquet that was both sweet and sickening, powerful and pungent in equal measure. This reliance on masking odors rather than cleansing the body led to practices that further deteriorated bodily hygiene. Linen shifts, for example, were perfumed instead of washed, and hair was doused in floral waters rather than rinsed with water and soap. Some women went so far as to wear perfumed sachets around their necks, at their waists, or sewn into their corsets to fight the stench of their own unbathed bodies. Gloves were soaked in scented oils and worn not just as a mark of status, but as a portable perfume dispenser, which a lady could press to her nose when the smells of the court, or her own person, became unbearable. Even bedding was not spared. Mattress stuffing might be sprinkled with dried lavender, rose petals, or powdered orris root to deceive the senses into perceiving cleanliness where there was none. One of the more curious adaptations of this olfactory obsession was the royal habit of scenting wigs, a trend that reached absurd heights in the courts of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Women of nobility wore large, ornate wigs powdered not only to lighten the color, but also to suppress the odor of sweat and mildew that accumulated after weeks or months of wear. The powder, often made from ground starch, wheat, rice, or even bones, was infused with fragrances ranging from violet to orange blossom. But because these wigs were rarely cleaned and sometimes infested with lice, the addition of perfume merely made the rot more complex rather than covering it effectively. The stench of sour sweat, aging powder, oils, and hair that had begun to decompose beneath the elaborate scaffolding of hairpieces could make standing near such women overwhelming, despite their elevated appearance. And the issue extended beyond the individual, spilling into the very architecture of court life. Rooms were scented with incense, potpourri, and even vinegar-spiked waters boiled in pots to release pleasant vapors, but the foulness they attempted to mask, human sweat, unwashed fabric, chamber pots poorly emptied, never truly left the air. Courtiers and servants alike grew accustomed to the perfume-soaked atmosphere, no longer recognizing the rank rot beneath the roses. It was not uncommon for maids and valets to suffer headaches or nausea from the strength of perfumes applied daily in thick, choking layers to their mistresses and masters, and yet this practice was celebrated, even admired, as a sign of refinement and elegance, rather than the desperate coping mechanism it had become. Even royal childbirth was steeped in this perfumed confusion. Laboring women, including queens, were surrounded by heavy curtains to preserve modesty, which also trapped heat and odor in the birthing chamber. The midwives and attending ladies burned sweet-smelling herbs and oils to bless the air, and the mother's body, already distressed and sweating, would be rubbed with perfumed waters during and after delivery, rather than bathed. The infant, too, was often powdered or anointed with scented oils before being presented, less to honor the child and more to shield onlookers from the natural smells of birth and blood. Hygiene, even in this most critical moment of life and vulnerability, was never prioritized over decorum and scent. Thus, the perfumed world of royal women, admired for its supposed elegance and sensory luxury, reveals itself upon closer inspection to be a veiled theater of decay, a spectacle of aromatic deception in which cleanliness was never the goal, only the illusion of it. And this illusion, clung to with such passion, would remain unchallenged until the rise of modern germ theory centuries later, when the true relationship between odor and disease would begin to be understood. Yet even then, the habits of masking rather than cleansing were slow to die, deeply ingrained in aristocratic tradition and vanity. And from this strange and fragrant realm of rose water and rancid wigs, the story drifts toward the hidden consequences such practices bore, not just for the body, but for the environment of the royal world itself. And yet, if there was any singular artifact of feminine daily life that bore the stain of royal negligence and cultural discomfort, it was perhaps most clearly seen in the hidden world of menstruation, a topic so steeped in silence, shame, and superstition that even the most powerful queens and princesses often had little recourse but to suffer in quiet indignity, adhering to age-old rituals that seemed more concerned with mysticism than with comfort or hygiene. The cycle, as it was euphemistically called in polite company, if mentioned at all, was viewed by medieval and early modern society not as a natural bodily function deserving of care and dignity, but rather as a periodic curse, a source of impurity, and a signal of both danger and weakness. Religious doctrine, medical ignorance, and social norms conspired to cast menstruating women, royal or common, as temporarily unclean, spiritually suspect, and even medically hazardous to others, with texts from the time warning that women in this state could cause wine to sour, crops to fail, or even mirrors to crack with a mere glance. In royal courts where appearances were everything, such ideas gave rise to a veil of secrecy that enveloped menstruation, encouraging noblewomen to conceal the reality of their cycles through silence and suppression, rather than address the physical discomforts and hygienic needs with care or innovation. Without the modern conveniences of absorbent pads or tampons, women relied instead on rudimentary materials, folded linen cloths, strips of old fabric, or bundles of softened rags, secured in place with strings or tucked into handmade belts, often reused without thorough washing due to the scarcity of clean water and the stigma of laundering such items openly. These makeshift menstrual rags were not sterilized or cleaned properly, especially in times of war, religious fasting, or seasonal hardship, when bathing was infrequent and privacy was even harder to come by. Royal women, cloistered behind chamber doors and surrounded by attendants, had no greater freedom than their poorer counterparts in this matter, and often less, bound by the expectations of public modesty and the constraints of elaborate garments that made frequent changing of cloths both inconvenient and conspicuous. Many would endure entire cycles wearing the same soiled linens beneath layer upon layer of brocade and lace, the resulting smell masked by perfumes and pomanders, and the discomfort endured with quiet endurance. Even palace physicians, educated as they were in Galenic and humoral theories, offered little practical advice beyond leaching or balancing fluids, which did nothing to alleviate the hygienic implications of menstruation in a world without plumbing or antiseptics. In some cultures, menstruating women were confined to separate chambers or discouraged from touching religious objects, eating certain foods, or engaging in court ceremonies, rules which, for royal women, translated into subtle exclusions and diplomatic inconveniences, especially if their timing clashed with state visits, weddings, or coronations. And still, despite their status, they were expected to maintain an illusion of effortless grace, to glide through their palaces as though untouched by the bodily functions that tethered them to nature. Some queens would develop private signals to indicate the onset of their cycle to their ladies-in-waiting, a discreet gesture or word whispered in the bedchamber, which would prompt the quiet fetching of cloths and fragrant oils, though even these small rituals did little to mitigate the discomfort or the social pressure to pretend nothing was amiss. And when accidents happened, when blood stained a cushion or a royal gown, the blame was often placed not on the lack of proper care, but on the woman's failure to control her own body, reinforcing a culture of shame that persisted for centuries. So it was that the most intimate of feminine experiences remained shrouded in ignorance and constraint, even among the highest ranks of society, reduced to a monthly inconvenience that must never be spoken of, and certainly never addressed in any way that might suggest the need for reform or compassion. In this way, the royal women of the past bled in silence, their suffering hidden beneath layers of silk and whispered gossip, and their hygiene left to chance, luck, and a great deal of uncomfortable endurance, until the day came when another aspect of their physical world would once again highlight the fragile line between beauty and decay, a daily routine that, while intended to preserve allure, often served only to magnify discomfort, as attention shifted from the body's internal rhythm to its outer adornment, and the royal obsession with elaborate makeup and cosmetics took center stage in the ongoing tale of unhygienic indulgence. There was yet another matter rarely spoken of, yet impossible to ignore, for it lay beneath the silks and jewels, hidden within the folds of velvet and the weight of layered skirts, a discomfort endured in silence by many royal women, and that was the sheer burden of undergarments, or more precisely, the lack of sanitary knowledge when it came to managing their most private moments. The notion of menstrual hygiene, if one could even call it that in the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, was shrouded in superstition, hushed by shame, and muddled by strange remedies that were neither helpful nor healthful, and for noblewomen, whose lives were woven with expectation and appearances, it became yet another area where suffering wore a crown and silence was the law of the chamber. For although their chambers were often perfumed and their beds laced with the softest linens the court could afford, there was no escaping the reality of nature, and during those monthly cycles, when the moon hung full in the sky and the body whispered its secret language, royal women were offered no sanctuary from discomfort. Instead, they were left to cope as best they could, often with methods passed down by midwives, chambermaids, or inherited from the tomes of ancient physicians who knew more of alchemy than anatomy. The materials used for absorbing menstrual flow were rudimentary, often involving folded cloths made from old linen, wool, or even moss. Yes, moss, thought to be absorbent and cooling, and placed between the legs with the hope that it would hold firm under the weight of skirts and time. These cloths were rarely washed properly due to the limitations of laundering at the time, and worse still, many believed that menstruating women were unclean in a spiritual sense, barred from religious rites, and often secluded or even forbidden from touching sacred objects, as if their condition brought with it some invisible contagion. But unlike the poor, who may have managed their monthly woes with minimal fuss or materials, royal women were expected to maintain a certain composure, a certain stillness, even while suffering cramps and stains and the dread of being discovered, and so their methods, though clothed in fine fabric, were as inadequate as any, and no less painful. To make matters more unfortunate, there was very little understanding of the body itself. Physicians of the time, often monks or men with no practical knowledge of female anatomy, wrote strange and alarming treatises on menstruation, claiming that it was a form of purging, that the female body needed to bleed to rid itself of excess humors, and if it did not, madness or death might follow. This led to terrifying treatments for women whose cycles were irregular. They might be bled further with leeches or cupped with heated glass to draw out the so-called poison, or given heavy tonics of herbs and minerals that did more harm than good. And those unfortunate enough to experience menopause were whispered about as if they were transforming into something unnatural, a withered crone, no longer fertile, no longer useful, sometimes even thought to have become spiritually dangerous. It was a time of deep ignorance wrapped in ritual, and for royal women, the pressure to conceal their condition was as suffocating as any corset ever laced around their ribs. Court dressmakers, aware of these secret sufferings, would sometimes stitch additional layers of cloth into the undergarments of queens and duchesses, not for comfort, but to avoid scandal, to protect the furniture, the gowns, and the dignity of the house. But the odor, which no lavender sachet or perfume bottle could fully mask, would still cling to the air like a silent herald of a shame no one dared name aloud. And so the women carried themselves stiffly, walking carefully, hiding stained garments in the bottom of trunks, or handing them off to trusted ladies in waiting with whispered instructions. For despite the gilded carriages, the polished marble halls, and the silken hangings of their chambers, these women bled like any other, and suffered more, for they had to do so in secret, never breaking character, never letting on that the crown pressed harder on some days than others. But it wasn't merely the lack of comfort that haunted these days, it was the fear. For if a stain was seen, if a smell was noticed, if a whisper passed too far beyond the curtains, it could become scandal, fuel for court gossip, a weapon in the hands of rivals or scheming courtiers who waited for any sign of weakness. And so, with each month, royal women endured their cycles like hidden battles, waged not with swords, but with woolen rags and herbal compresses, their dignity held together by pins and prayer. The Church offered no comfort, often reinforcing the idea that menstruation was a punishment, a consequence of Eve's sin, and the women who lived under this shadow did so with bowed heads and clenched teeth, pretending all was well even as the cramps tore through their bellies and the fear of exposure haunted their every step. In some regions, more elaborate rituals surrounded this time. In France, for instance, it was once believed that menstrual blood could sour wine, wilt flowers, or send dogs mad with rage, leading to the cruel confinement of women in remote chambers or the banning of certain activities during their cycle. In royal households, these superstitions persisted in gentler forms. Women were discouraged from handling food, from engaging in social events, or from touching religious relics, and while these restrictions were often couched in terms of rest and recovery, they were rooted in deep mistrust of the female body, an ancient suspicion that the womb was a wild and unpredictable thing. It was a lonely time, made lonelier by the quietness demanded of it, and though queens ruled nations and signed treaties and mothered dynasties, they were never free from this monthly sentence, and never offered proper relief. Even centuries later, long after advances in medicine had begun to chip away at the old beliefs, the customs of court lagged behind. tradition was slow to release its grip. Well into the 18th century, noblewomen still relied on makeshift pads pinned into linen undergarments, washed by hand in cold water and hung discreetly behind screens to dry, far from the curious eyes of servants or visiting dignitaries. And yet, despite these harsh conditions, they dressed themselves in elegance, smiled through ceremonies, and curtsied with grace, hiding all signs of discomfort behind powdered faces and painted fans. Their bodies bore the cost, of course. Infections were common, inflammation too, and the emotional toll of never being allowed to speak of one's pain accumulated silently, like dust in the rafters of a forgotten chapel. And so, each cycle came and went, unspoken but never unfelt, and the women of the court endured it with the same stoicism they applied to every other indignity dressed in pearls and protocol. From young girls stepping into their first court gown, to aged queens hiding silver threads in their braided hair, the story was the same, suffering in silence, because to bleed was shameful, but to be caught bleeding was a scandal. And in the hush of the palace halls, where secrets echoed softly against stone, there was no place to complain, only the flicker of a candle, the rustle of heavy skirts, and the quiet resolve to carry on. The discomfort of clothing extended far beyond physical weight and rigid corsetry, for the very fabrics and materials used to construct royal garments introduced their own unhygienic complications, forming yet another invisible web that entangled noblewomen in a quiet, enduring misery. Much of the clothing worn by high-born ladies was made not merely for beauty or elegance, but as a symbol of wealth and status, a reflection of one's rank woven into brocade and velvet, embellished with silver thread or gold leaf, edged with intricate lacework imported at great cost. Yet such materials were often heavy, unventilated, and remarkably difficult to clean, especially in an era when washing such delicate and valuable items posed more risk than reward. Most noblewomen did not launder their gowns at all, not in any modern sense of the word, for water, particularly hot water, was considered ruinous to fine fabrics, and so the sweat of summer courts, the musk of winter halls, and the oily perfumes meant to mask it all would accumulate slowly in the folds and linings of garments worn again and again. It was common for a dress, particularly an ornate court gown or ceremonial robe, to go unwashed for months or even years, with only superficial brushing or dabbing used to remove visible dirt. The linens beneath the dress might be changed, if a woman had sufficient attendance, but the outer layers, the ones most often seen, admired, and envied, remained as repositories of all the body's minor indignities. As days stretched into weeks, the inner seams darkened with skin oils, the bodice stiffened with dried perspiration, and the embroidery began to harbor not only the stories of courtly events but also the faintest traces of decay. The practice of powdering the skin and dousing oneself with floral waters could only go so far in counteracting the olfactory truth of such garments. At times, the entire ensemble might be sprayed with a mix of alcohol and herbs to provide a temporary veil of freshness, but these quick remedies did little to cleanse and much to coat, layering scent upon scent, texture upon texture, until the clothing became a palimpsest of noble life in all its unsavory realism. Equally troubling was the construction of the garments themselves, which were often fastened with pins, laces, and hooks in places so inaccessible that a woman required assistance merely to dress or undress, meaning that removing clothing for hygiene, bathing, relieving oneself, or merely airing the skin was no easy matter. The gowns were designed for public display, not private comfort, and this meant that ventilation was poor, skin chafing was common, and even the act of perspiration beneath the many layers became a source of irritation and infection. Silk, though light and luxurious, did not breathe well when stacked beneath brocade and velvet, and wool, often worn in colder months, retained dampness with a tenacity that invited rashes and boils. Undergarments, if worn at all, might be changed more regularly, but even this depended on wealth, the availability of laundresses, and the presence of a full-time maid who could draw and carry warm water, rinse linens by hand, and hang them in rare, clean air to dry, tasks which many women, even noblewomen, might only enjoy in the grandest of palaces or during the most accommodating seasons. Insects, too, found refuge in the layers of unwashed finery, from the lice that crawled between seams and linings to the moths that laid their eggs in the warm folds of infrequently worn capes or fur trims. Some noblewomen combated this threat with lavender sachets or cedar chests, and yet even these protections did not always suffice, for once a garment became infested, it could rarely be saved. Tailors and seamstresses were sometimes employed not merely to make new gowns, but to continually repair old ones, replacing damaged panels or infested sections while leaving the rest of the garment intact. This practice preserved the illusion of luxury while concealing the quiet degradation happening beneath the surface, a metaphor, perhaps, for court life itself, brilliant to the eye, but riddled with rot in its hidden corners. And then there was the matter of foot hygiene, or more specifically, the complete lack of it. Shoes worn by royal women, though often opulent in their outward design, adorned with pearls, embroidery, and soft leathers, were rarely designed with comfort or cleanliness in mind. Stockings were worn for warmth and modesty, but they absorbed sweat and grime from long days standing on hard stone floors or sitting in drafty chambers. These stockings were not washed daily, and the shoes themselves, sometimes made of velvet or silk, could not be cleaned without damage. Feet remained encased for hours, sometimes for days, without fresh air or opportunity for proper washing. Fungal infections were not uncommon, and the courtly practice of foot-binding or tight-lacing shoes for aesthetic purposes only worsened the situation, leading to blisters, sores, and long-term foot deformities that went untreated. Still, amidst all these challenges, women were expected to maintain an air of grace, elegance, and effortless charm. Even as their gowns grew musty and their stockings stale, they performed their roles with smiles, navigating court dances, royal audiences, and endless rounds of social performance. The performance extended even to how they moved, the slow glide of a curtsy, the precise angle of a wrist, the delicate balance of a fan held to the side, all orchestrated movements designed to preserve a feminine ideal that had little to do with comfort or cleanliness. And yet beneath the surface, beneath the silks and perfumes, lay skin that rarely breathed freely, hair that itched beneath bejeweled pins, and bodies quietly suffering the toll of garments that were never meant to be kind. From the heavy embroidered gowns that weighed on the shoulders to the silken slippers that trapped dampness against the skin, the royal wardrobe was a gilded prison, admired by all, envied by many, but endured only by the women who had no choice but to wear it. Their attire, so often the subject of admiration in court paintings and whispered gossip, hid not only the physical body but also the uncomfortable truth of life in royal circles, that beneath the grandeur, filth lingered quietly, unspoken but ever present. And as they moved through corridors perfumed not with cleanliness but with centuries-old remedies and fading herbs, their garments swaying silently around them, they carried not just the weight of expectation, but the invisible burden of hygiene denied. And it was this very silence surrounding bodily needs, this insistence on maintaining a pristine illusion at any cost, that gave rise to the next enduring trial, a form of daily suffering so normalized that few dared question it, even as it shaped the lives and health of countless royal women. Despite the exaggerated reverence shown to royalty, and despite the incense burned to conceal the stale air of enclosed courts, the royal women of many noble houses bore a deeply uncomfortable relationship with cleanliness that stretched far beyond bodily odor or bathing. It extended into the realm of spiritual purity, often muddled with superstition and misunderstood health doctrines. Few things exemplified this more than the way they treated their clothing, for garments, especially undergarments, were rarely washed. These linens, laced with sweat and bodily secretions, were worn repeatedly, sometimes for weeks at a time, under the belief that washing them too often would cause the fabric to decay or the body to become more susceptible to illness. Indeed, in some royal circles, it was thought that a layer of dirt and oil served as a protective seal, guarding the pores against the dangers of drafts or foul airs that were believed to carry disease. And so, beneath silk brocades and velvet gowns, the inner layers told a different story, one of moisture trapped against skin, of fermenting oils and skin flakes, of louse-infested seams, and of the gradual dulling of once bright linen to a mottled yellow-gray hue that bespoke neither elegance nor health. Laundresses, when employed, were tasked with boiling water and scrubbing linens with harsh ash soaps or lye, a caustic substance that often weakened the threads and left the fabric stiff and scratchy, making many royal ladies hesitant to clean them too often. The cumbersome process, requiring vast amounts of firewood, soap, and labor, meant laundry days were rare events, even in the largest palaces. More frequently, stained or soiled garments were simply hung out to air in the sun or sprayed with perfume and vinegar, the latter of which only masked the smells without truly cleansing the fibers. This cycle of avoidance created a cumulative effect. Dresses layered over unwashed undergarments became musty over time, the brocade underarms stained, the corset linings darkened, and the bodices stiff with body oil. Yet outward appearances remained composed and genteel, upheld by finely embroidered gowns and powdered faces. Even as hidden beneath, the body waged a quiet war with its own excretions. Even more striking was how infrequently these underlayers were changed between menstruation cycles. With no absorbent hygiene products resembling those available today, women resorted to makeshift cloth rags, sometimes called clouts, which were tied in place with belts or strings and reused multiple times. These cloths were rarely cleaned properly, often left to dry by windows or fireplaces, then folded and used again without any form of disinfection. Royal ladies, concerned with modesty and silence around such matters, often handled these personal items themselves or with the help of one trusted servant. In colder climates or seasons, when water was harder to access or firewood was scarce, the chance of thorough washing dwindled even further. Combined with layers of heavy skirts, woolen stockings, and tight stays, the environment beneath those regal garments could quickly become ripe for infections, rashes, and the persistent itching that many women accepted as a natural part of life. The great irony was that these royal women had access to the finest fabrics, skilled seamstresses, and elaborate wardrobes, yet their underclothes, perhaps the most intimate and crucial elements for hygiene, were often treated with the least attention. Shaped more by myth and fear than by any sound understanding of health, their reluctance to cleanse the garments closest to their skin perpetuated an atmosphere not only of discomfort but of a creeping invisibility. Invisible to guests and courtiers, of course, but not to themselves. A princess might spend hours preparing for court, powdering her skin, applying rouge, curling her hair with iron tongs, fastening jewelry and pinning lace. Yet beneath it all, she would be acutely aware of the dampness at her thighs, the itch at her waist, the heaviness of fabric that had grown stiff from days or weeks of continuous wear. And still, she would smile, curtsy, and take her place beside kings and nobles, exuding poise and power. These layers of unseen filth carried consequences that extended beyond discomfort. Persistent infections, skin ailments, and even illnesses such as urinary tract infections or skin boils were quietly endured, especially when voicing complaints was seen as improper or weak. Some women developed chronic conditions due to prolonged exposure to bacteria-laden fabrics, worsened by corsets and tight stays that restricted airflow and trapped moisture. And yet, these matters were rarely documented, for who among the court physicians would dare suggest to a duchess or queen that the cause of her suffering might be the clothing she had worn too long or the linen she had not washed? Instead, ailments were attributed to vague notions of imbalanced humors or bad dreams, or even divine punishment for perceived moral failings, while the true culprits remained cloaked beneath embroidery and pearls. And so the cycle continued, of sweat soaked into bodices, of lace collars carrying the faint scent of old vinegar, of petticoats that clung unpleasantly to skin during humid summers. Royal laundries might bustle with activity during special festivals or ceremonies, but most days, the quiet neglect of undergarments remained an unspoken truth in the corridors of palaces. It was an intimate burden carried by many noble women, often in silence, accepted as one of the many discomforts that accompanied privilege. And while their outward lives shimmered with jewels and splendor, beneath those layers lay a hidden world of discomfort, of chafed skin and lingering smells, of quiet suffering that accompanied each rustling step and every courteous nod. It was a burden they shared not just with one another, but with generations of royal women before and after them, each inheriting the same whispered rules, the same fear of water and obsession with appearance, the same half-truths about health and hygiene. And as the days passed in their palatial chambers and candlelit salons, these unwashed garments told a story all their own, a story not of elegance or grace, but of misunderstanding, habit, and the silent endurance of centuries of women whose skin bore the weight of tradition. And so, as the candles burned low and the corridors of the palace fell again into that strange hush of nocturnal stillness, the matter of skin treatments came to occupy its own strange corner in the intricate mosaic of royal hygiene. In an age where alchemy brushed shoulders with early medicine and superstition formed the bedrock of every daily ritual, the pursuit of smooth and pale skin among royal women often meandered into territories that defied reason, safety, and logic. To appear blemish-free and ethereal was not merely a preference. It was a declaration of class, divine favor, and unearthly refinement. The skin was the canvas upon which nobility was silently painted, and to maintain its youthful bloom, countless royal women subjected themselves to concoctions and remedies that today would chill the modern spine. Foremost among these practices was the enthusiastic use of lead-based cosmetics. Known as Venetian ceruse or spirit of Saturn, this mixture of white lead and vinegar was applied liberally to the face, neck, and chest to achieve a ghostly, alabaster complexion, a hue associated with purity and wealth, as tanning was reserved for peasants laboring beneath the sun. The cosmetics smoothed the face into a lifeless mask, concealing pock scars, freckles, and age, but beneath its porcelain sheen, it slowly poisoned the wearer. Over time, the lead seeped into the skin and bloodstream, leading to muscle paralysis, digestive collapse, hair loss, and the very skin decay it was meant to disguise. Yet this cycle of damage only increased its use, as blemished skin required more layers of the deadly white paint, and the illusion of youth became both a mask and a prison. To complement this chalky appearance, arsenic sometimes joined the regimens. In small doses, some believed it could lend the skin a luminous quality and even serve as a beauty tonic. In practice, arsenic ingestion slowly dismantled the body systems from within, clouding the eyes, weakening the heart, and turning the breath foul. And yet, records show that noblewomen in France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire regularly consumed diluted arsenic wafers, believing them to be gifts from nature to preserve their fading youth. Pale was not only fashionable, it was weaponized as a symbol of health and status, in stark contrast to the robust, ruddy tones of laboring commoners. Then came the exfoliants, crafted from crushed pearls, ground eggshells, and even powdered animal bones. Mixed with vinegar or rosewater, these abrasive substances were rubbed onto the face with silken cloths or, in some cases, stiff brushes made from the hair of wild boars. The royal skin was scrubbed with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for polishing a silver goblet. It left many with raw, inflamed faces that became even more dependent on the soothing, but equally harmful white paste of lead to calm the angry skin. Royal spas were no better. In many palaces, special rooms were dedicated to the mixing and application of facial pastes, poultices, and balms. Some used pigeon droppings, thought to cure skin infections and soften the complexion. Others swore by the milk baths of donkeys or goats, where royal women would submerge themselves for hours in tubs filled with warm animal milk infused with herbs and floral oils. While such rituals may sound luxurious, the milk would quickly spoil in the absence of refrigeration, leading to bacterial exposure, skin irritation, and sometimes infection. And the servants who prepared these treatments often reused the same materials without cleaning the containers or changing the contents, further compounding the risk of contamination. Perfumed oils played their part, too. Lavender, myrrh, civet, or musk, harvested from the glands of exotic animals and mixed into creams or salves. They were believed to revitalize skin and slow aging, but they came at great cost, not only in coin but in ecological cruelty and biohazard. The oils were applied not just to the skin but into the ears, the nostrils, even behind the eyelids, anywhere thought to harbor decay or dullness. In some royal courts, it was customary to leave these fragrant salves on the skin for hours before gently scraping them away with silver blades, a method that often resulted in microscopic cuts and openings through which infection might creep silently into the bloodstream. But perhaps the most peculiar of all were the blood treatments. In Italy and France, some noblewomen believed in the restorative power of young blood. Chickens were bled in small ceremonies, and their warm blood applied directly to the cheeks, intended to impart a fresh, youthful flush. Others took to leeching, not for medical necessity, but as a cosmetic ritual to balance the blood and encourage the glow of youth. In practice, this often left them anemic, dizzy, and weak, their complexions pale for all the wrong reasons, and their bodies weakened from the very acts intended to preserve them. All the while, mirrors were rare and often warped. Without clear reflection, women depended on handmaidens to tell them how they looked. Flattery abounded, and with it, a false sense of success. The face in the silver mirror, shadowed and dim, told them nothing of the bruised pores beneath the lead or the swollen veins beneath the skin rubbed raw by salt and bone. They trusted their rituals, their knowledge, their customs inherited from centuries of tradition and myth. And so, day after day, the skin treatments continued, cloaked in scented powders and thick perfumes, offering not beauty but a quiet erosion of health beneath the surface. And as these practices persisted behind velvet curtains and polished doors, the garments that cloaked these same bodies carried their own burdens of decay and discomfort. For what touched the skin next was not the cool breath of linen, but the tight, unwashed grip of regal attire, layered deep with dust, sweat, and sometimes things far fouler still. And so it was, in the shadowy interiors of palatial chambers where daylight barely touched the stone walls, that royal women, burdened by the expectations of courtly grace and divine modesty, embraced a ritual both curious and quietly unsettling, fumigation by aromatic smoke, or smoking the womb, a practice as pervasive as it was peculiar, believed by physicians of the era to cure imagined ailments of the female body by encouraging vapors to flow inward or outward through what they termed female passages. It was widely accepted, by both noblewomen and their medical advisers, that a woman's womb could wander inside her body, a condition known then as the wandering womb, believed to cause fainting spells, hysteria, or sudden fits of weeping, and so to anchor it, to coax it back into place. Her body was subjected to fragrant smokes and potent aromas designed to lure the rogue organ to its rightful place. A treatment administered not in private, but often in the presence of midwives, herbalists, or even court physicians, who would burn lavender, rosemary, or, in more extreme cases, sulphurous compounds near the lower body while the woman reclined over a specially carved stool, her gown lifted, her dignity suspended in an atmosphere thick with a mingling of superstition and scented haze. This practice, intended to calm the humors and restore feminine balance, became a staple of female hygiene for the privileged classes. Yet it was hardly rooted in sanitation or comfort. Rather, it was an extension of the belief that the female body was inherently unstable, unpredictable, and in need of regular interventions, not with clean water or gentle care, but with smoldering herbs, ashes, and, at times, substances far less pleasant, like dried dung or charred lichen, additions made by healers who swore by the strength of acrid fumes to cleanse the soul as much as the body. The smoke would waft upward, curling around bare thighs and settling into crevices, lingering in the folds of clothing and clinging to the draperies and carpets of their private chambers, leaving behind a fragrance that might be sweet to some but oppressive to others, especially those unaccustomed to the heavy perfume of ancient remedies clinging to flesh and hair. For many women of the court, particularly those experiencing what was vaguely termed female troubles, which could refer to anything from irregular bleeding to emotional unrest, this practice was not optional but scheduled, administered regularly and sometimes daily, its effects as psychological as physical, offering a kind of ritualistic reassurance that something was being done, that the invisible forces causing their malaise were being drawn out through the power of heated herbs and whispered prayers. Yet the smoke, rising into the body and saturating clothing, rarely offered true comfort. Instead, it left the skin coated in an invisible film, and the fabric soaked in a scent that mingled with the already unwashed garments, intensifying the natural body odors that courtly garments so desperately tried to mask with perfumes stitched into the lining of sleeves and collars. Worse still, these smoking sessions were often followed not by washing or rinsing, but by more layers of silk and velvet, trapping the smoky residue against the skin, which already bore the marks of other treatments, ointments laced with mercury, powders of crushed pearls, and oils derived from animal fat, all of which mingled with the fumes, creating an alchemical stew upon the skin that simmered quietly throughout the day. For those attending court functions or ceremonial processions, the blend of perfumes, powders, and smokes was overwhelming, a storm of conflicting aromas that clung to every breath and stained every cushion and cloak, and yet within this cloud of fragrant confusion there remained the quiet belief that cleanliness had been achieved, not through water or soap, but through ritual and scent and the manipulation of unseen forces. Those tasked with administering these smoke rituals, usually older midwives or household women with years of experience, held a strange sort of reverence in the household, their hands trusted to balance the smoldering bowls and guide the noblewoman into position, their voices hushed as they chanted charms or simply counted the minutes in silence, watching the coals turn gray and the herbs crumble to ash. And though their presence was meant to be comforting, there was an intimacy to the act that left many women feeling exposed, not only physically but emotionally, as the chamber filled with curling plumes that seemed to whisper old truths and ancient fears, carrying with them the ghosts of every woman who had sat in that same chair, breathed that same smoke, and hoped that, somehow, the scent would settle the chaos within. Still, despite the discomfort, the awkwardness, and the burning eyes from overzealous applications, this ritual endured, for in the minds of queens and duchesses, princesses and noble daughters alike, the idea of a womb unmoored or a body possessed by vaporous imbalance was too terrifying to ignore, and so they submitted, again and again, to the smoke, believing each session brought them closer to stability, to peace, to an internal order that no bath could provide. And it was in this belief, steeped in fear and soot and superstition, that they passed their hours of quiet suffering, wrapped in heavy dresses and bearing the invisible weight of customs no one dared question, not even as the smoke coiled around their ankles and slipped between the stone tiles below, seeking escape, much as they might have wished to do themselves, had they the freedom or the voice to speak that simple, dangerous word, no. But to say no was not a luxury afforded to women of their station, and so they endured, and the smoke continued to rise, soft and swirling, filling the air with the illusion of care, even as the room itself grew darker with every breath, and the centuries ahead promised only more rituals, more fumigation, and more silence clinging to perfumed skin. And as the layered garments pressed inwards with every breath and tightened further with every tug of the corset strings, the discomfort royal women endured did not end with the waking hours or social engagements, but crept also into the quiet corners of the night, lingering long after the footsteps faded down the hallways of palaces and the candles guttered to low orange glows. For in those darkened chambers filled with tapestries, perfumed pillows, and embroidered sheets, another hygienic habit, or more precisely, the lack of one, took its place among the other discomforts, the failure to adequately address nighttime sanitation and private bodily needs. Royal women, hemmed in by modesty, layered clothing, rigid court etiquette, and deeply entrenched taboos, often resorted to unsanitary or absurdly impractical measures when nature's quiet call arrived under cover of night. Despite access to luxurious surroundings, the truth remained that palace plumbing was either non-existent or so rudimentary that it may as well have been ceremonial, and that privacy itself was more symbolic than real, with servants constantly present and eavesdropping walls never far. The result of this awkward conundrum was that chamber pots, often ornamental and misleadingly elegant, became the nightly solution to a deeply personal need, yet their usage brought with it more embarrassment and complication than convenience. Constructed from porcelain or pewter, often painted with delicate flowers or gilded trim, these pots were sometimes kept beneath grand canopy beds or tucked within wooden cabinets that disguised their lowly purpose. Yet their purpose, no matter how artistically masked, remained tied to human waste, and for women wrapped in yards of stiff brocade and crinoline, maneuvering to use one was neither simple nor hygienic. In many cases, they had to rely on chambermaids to lift and adjust their nightclothes, to position the pot beneath them, and to remove it afterward, creating a deeply awkward ritual performed in silence or half-whispered apologies. These pots were emptied not by the women themselves, but by underpaid servants who carried their contents through winding corridors, past courtiers and sometimes guests, to rudimentary disposal areas, often little more than cesspits or ditches within the palace walls. The stench of these poorly managed sanitation routines lingered invisibly behind the opulence, and the damp, acrid air of the lower levels of royal residences often gave away the truth that beneath all the elegance lay a very human problem, untreated and unresolved. It was not uncommon for royal bedchambers to hold several pots, hidden behind privacy screens or tucked beneath seating, especially for queens who had recently given birth or suffered from delicate health. And yet, despite their abundance, these pots were rarely cleaned with the kind of thoroughness modern minds might expect. Often they were rinsed briefly with rose water or lightly scented with herbs, but true sterilization was impossible without boiling water and disinfectants, neither of which were common in most palatial households. The illusion of freshness, carried by lavender sachets or potpourri, is all that stood between royal noses and the growing bacterial buildup at the bottom of these vessels. For women of noble standing, admitting to the smells, stains, or discomforts of these arrangements would have been considered undignified, if not scandalous, and so a conspiracy of silence formed, enforced by protocol and custom, leaving royal women to suffer in private while public life demanded composure and grace. Further complicating matters was the dress code even for sleep. Unlike modern nightgowns or pajamas, sleepwear in earlier centuries was hardly designed for convenience. Heavy linen shifts, embroidered sleeping robes, and sometimes even understays or corset-like bindings were worn through the night. These layers, along with long stockings and the ever-present chemise, made nocturnal relief an ordeal that required assistance, maneuvering, and, often, pain. Some aristocratic women were trained to control their bodily needs for extended periods to avoid nighttime disturbances altogether, a feat praised by etiquette instructors but lamented privately by many who suffered urinary tract infections, bladder complications, and other ailments brought about by chronic holding. Doctors of the time, still influenced by humoral theory and nervous about female anatomy, seldom advised otherwise, offering instead vague tonics or herbal teas to encourage balance, as though virtue could heal the inconvenience of anatomy. Compounding the situation was the lack of proper hand-washing facilities. Though basins and pitchers were present, their water was cold, stagnant, and only occasionally changed. Towels were shared, rough, and rarely washed with soap, and so the aftermath of using chamber pots often left both the user and the chambermaid with little true cleanliness. Perfumes, gloves, and powder returned to mask the senses in the morning, but the truth lingered like the scent of damp straw in the quiet corners of an antechamber. In some royal courts, particularly in France and Italy, perfumed gloves became a popular method to shield the nostrils from unpleasant odors, and fans scented with vinegar or herbs were carried during private meetings, subtly waved beneath the nose when conversation drifted too close to unpleasant smells, an unspoken acknowledgment that hygiene was failing even the most elevated among them. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of all this was the contradiction between the perception of cleanliness and its practice. Royal women were expected to embody purity and grace, their presence symbolic of order and divine right, but in the private realm they fought a constant battle against dirt, discomfort, and decay. Palaces lacked proper plumbing, and the architects who designed them prioritized grandeur over sanitation, believing that beauty and size were the highest values of royal living. As such, the very layout of these buildings worked against any effort toward hygienic living. Bedchambers were far from kitchens or water sources, latrines were isolated and poorly ventilated, and bath chambers, if present at all, were rarely used for full body cleansing. And so the chamber pot remained a nightly reminder of the limits of courtly illusion, its handle cold and its contents warm, a quiet vessel of discomfort passed between silks and secrets beneath the velvet canopy of royal dreams. This ritual, repeated night after night, became an unspoken truth in the life of royal women, a truth carried in silence by maids who emptied the pots, by courtiers who scented the halls, by doctors who avoided the subject, and by queens and princesses who endured the indignity without complaint. And even as perfumes thickened and routines became more elaborate, the underlying problem remained unsolved, waiting quietly in the shadows of the most splendid palaces of Europe. It is to another of these uncomfortable rituals that we now turn, one that involved not only the private spaces of women's chambers, but also the painful and neglected state of their teeth, which, much like the rest of their hygiene, suffered not from poverty but from persistent misunderstanding. The years drifted by like slow-turning pages of a fading book, and the scent of rosewater and oil lingered in the halls, masking the deeper, earthier odors that permeated the tapestries and floorboards. Within the painted chambers and perfumed wardrobes of royalty, there thrived a peculiar custom that might appear unfathomable to modern sensibilities: the generous and often extreme use of lead-based cosmetics. These thick, powdery layers of white and rouge were applied with ritualistic reverence, seen as both a sign of nobility and a veil of timeless beauty, yet beneath their ghostly sheen lurked a truth far more sinister. For centuries, royal women adorned their faces with Venetian ceruse or other mixtures composed of white lead and vinegar, believing that the resulting pale complexion signified delicacy, refinement, and aristocratic virtue. The whiter the face, the more removed from the laboring classes they appeared, a cultural ideal that clung fiercely to courtly identity. Yet, what was intended to repel signs of the common world in appearance became an invitation for decay beneath the skin. Each morning, these noblewomen would sit in silence or idle conversation while a lady-in-waiting gently dusted their cheeks with the softest brushes, pressing the lethal powder into pores and cracks, layering it over sores, blemishes, and sunburns that festered beneath. The skin, unable to breathe and subjected to chemical corrosion, often broke into ulcers and rashes, which were then masked with more powder, thickening like plaster on a rotting wall. In time, the lead would leach into their bloodstream, poisoning their organs and fogging their minds, causing tooth loss, hair thinning, and a drawn waxen pallor that oddly mirrored the beauty standard they so desperately aimed to uphold. Their lips were painted with cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment, which tingled at first and numbed eventually, eating away at delicate tissues while imparting a luscious crimson sheen. And yet, despite these visible signs of deterioration, the practice persisted across generations, passed down like jewels in a crown, because the court's idea of beauty remained unyielding, pale, painted, and poisonous. No warnings from physicians or whispers from skeptical apothecaries could undo the centuries of aesthetic doctrine that had woven itself into every mirror and portrait. It wasn't uncommon for royal ladies to suffer from neurological symptoms, tremors, mood swings, memory loss, all brushed away as female hysteria or melancholia rather than acknowledged as the slow toll of cosmetic rot. Their gowns shimmered with pearls and embroidery, their fingers weighed with rings, and their faces, pale as funeral linen, glowed eerily under the candlelight of courtly balls and state dinners. But beneath the powders and pigments, skin tissue struggled to survive, and the real cost of maintaining such elegance often went unspoken, hidden in veils and portraits and distant stares. Even in death, their faces would sometimes be touched up one final time, made pristine and white, as though the mask they wore in life was too essential to discard even in the grave. And so the tradition bled into paintings and poems, immortalizing an image that was as dangerous as it was admired. While common women were burned by the sun and aged by the winds, royal women, swathed in their cosmetic armor, decayed under their own chosen mask, victims of a toxic ritual believed to elevate them above the ordinary. The palace walls bore witness to these fading visages, beautiful, distant, and doomed, while outside, the world changed and science slowly inched forward, whispering truths that would one day unravel these fatal customs and leave them as echoes in the history of royal vanity. Yet still, long after the lead powders were finally set aside, the shadows of their use lingered in tales and tinctures, in faded portraits and dusty dressing tables, forever entwined with the myth of courtly beauty. As the decades slipped silently into centuries, the palaces and castles of old Europe stood witness to the slow decline of traditions once regarded as sacrosanct, their halls echoing with the memories of rituals that had long outlived their usefulness. Yet among these fading customs, one practice clung stubbornly to the inner chambers of royal women: the excessive use of perfumes, not as mere enhancements of scent, but as a desperate defense against the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, festering fabrics, and stagnant air. In an era where regular bathing was frowned upon or feared, where layers of heavy gowns trapped sweat against the skin for weeks on end, perfume did not simply signal elegance, it became armor, a fragrant shield against decay. The royal toilette was an elaborate affair, with scents imported from far-off lands: jasmine from the East, sandalwood from India, rosewater from Persia, and civet or musk scraped from glands of unfortunate animals. These precious oils and tinctures were stored in glass vials and gold-leafed bottles that sparkled like treasures, each drop carefully chosen and dabbed upon the wrist, beneath the ear, or upon the breastbone like a prayer whispered against the body's betrayal. But the perfumes were not always used with subtlety. In fact, many royal women were known to douse themselves in layers upon layers of potent mixtures, until their presence could be detected several rooms away, their fragrance lingering even after they had gone, like ghosts of their passing. Their bed sheets were soaked in floral oils, their gloves perfumed with crushed herbs, their handkerchiefs steeped in lavender, and their wigs and hairpieces powdered with scented dust to mask the moldy undertones of human hair that had not been properly cleaned in months. The result was a complex mixture of odors, sweet and rank, floral and foul, that clung to them in a cloud as thick as fog. Rather than cleansing the skin and allowing it to breathe, these women layered scents over grime, attempting to overwrite the sour musk of sweat and illness with artificial sweetness. But the human body, trapped beneath silks and satins, continued to rebel in silence, issuing rashes, sores, and infections beneath the invisible layers of rot. Servants and ladies-in-waiting were often assigned the task of maintaining this illusion of freshness, scrubbing armpits with perfumed cloths, patting powder into crevices, and applying scented oils to feet swollen and cracked from days of standing in stiff shoes. And while perfume temporarily soothed the senses, it offered no solution to the underlying ailments that simmered beneath the surface. Infections would fester undetected beneath corsets and chemises, masked only by the rose and were smeared onto open skin. The air in royal chambers grew thick with competing fragrances, mingling with the sourness of chamber pots and the mustiness of ancient tapestries until it formed a haze of confusion, a sickly sweet blend of beauty and decay that many mistook for opulence. Doctors, when called, were more likely to prescribe further aromatic treatments than to advise the risky practice of bathing. It was widely believed that perfume could purify the air, cleanse the blood, and even protect against disease. The theory of miasma, that foul odors caused illness, only encouraged the liberal use of scent, making perfume not just a luxury, but a supposed shield against death itself. Yet, behind all this olfactory opulence lay the quieter truth. Perfume was not cleansing. It was a mask, a fragrant deception layered over poor hygiene and unhealthy habits. The skin, suffocated under oil and powder, became a landscape of slow ruin. Rashes worsened. Fungal infections spread in the dark folds of the body. Breath grew stale from untreated tooth decay, and feet blistered in damp shoes that hadn't seen fresh air in seasons. Still, the practice continued, inherited like jewelry or gowns from mother to daughter, an expectation more than a choice. The art of perfuming was so deeply entwined with the image of royalty that to appear without it was to risk seeming common, or worse, unclean. Only much later, when medical understanding evolved and sanitation became linked with health, did the practice of masking body odor with perfume begin to fade, replaced gradually by the revolutionary concept of actually removing the source of the odor through washing. And so, the perfume bottle, once a queen's most treasured possession, became merely an accessory, its purpose shifting from camouflage to enhancement. But the ghosts of that era lingered still, wafting through palace halls and dusty archives, carried in the faded letters and perfumed paper of long-dead aristocrats who once believed that a cloud of scent could hide the sins of the flesh. Even today, the history of those fragrant rituals remains embedded in the cultural memory of beauty, a reminder that for generations, sweetness had been used to conceal sickness and luxury to cover neglect. Beneath the perfume, the body had always spoken, but for too long, no one had dared to listen. And so it was, with the court's filthy linens piled high in every chamber, the stench of lavender oils unable to mask the reality, and women of power steeped in a paradox of refinement and grime, that we arrive at the final and perhaps most ironic habit among the worst hygienic practices of royal women, the ritual of scented smoke fumigation, also known as vaginal fumigation or fumée de siege. Cloaked in the illusion of purification and femininity, it was often performed with great ceremony, as noblewomen seated themselves upon special perforated stools beneath which smoldered bowls of aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and, often, ingredients whose effects were less than benign. These sessions, surrounded by screens to shield the act from prying eyes, were seen as a form of intimate cleansing or spiritual renewal, yet in truth, they more frequently acted as chemical irritants, doing more harm than healing. Lavender, rosemary, juniper berries, frankincense, even bits of burned cloth and tar were mixed in elaborate recipes passed down by midwives or court attendants posing as physicians, and the resulting clouds of pungent smoke would rise slowly, clinging to the folds of the woman's gown, curling through the hair perfumed with rose oil, drifting into the nose and mouth with each slow breath, a hazy ritual mistaken for grace. The act, for all its elegance in practice, was a desperate attempt to mask the reality of poor hygiene with ritualized mystique. It soothed not the body, but the mind burdened with guilt or disease, and its widespread popularity among the elite had more to do with preserving appearances than promoting health. Physicians of the time, where they existed at court, might warn of the humoral imbalance such practices caused, yet their voices were often drowned out by tradition and the deep-rooted belief in masking symptoms with scent, heat, and superstition. It was not uncommon for women to report dizziness, fainting, or worse after prolonged sessions, though these ailments were conveniently attributed to female humors, the stars, or a passing melancholy, rather than the caustic fumes they willingly inhaled. And so, amid the thick veils of perfumed steam and whispered reassurances, noblewomen sat still for hours, convinced that they were drawing illness out through the smoke, not realizing that many were inviting it in. In a world where appearance outweighed substance and illusion danced in the place of science, the royal woman, adored and admired, was often also a silent sufferer, trapped not just in corsets and custom, but in cycles of misguided rituals that bound her to a vision of cleanliness far removed from the truth. From unwashed hair tucked beneath golden caps to corsets never removed, and now to the smoldering fires beneath the skirts, she carried with her the invisible burden of a body kept not well, but pleasing. It is here, in this final image of a queen seated on smoke, noble and still, unaware of the danger wafting around her, that the story settles, a reminder that even royalty, for all its perfumes and pearls, was never immune to the grime of its own myth.